7 maps. That's all it took to unravel what I thought I understood about the history of exploration. Not 7 famous maps. Not the Mercator projection hanging in every classroom. Not Magellan's route reproduced in 1,000 textbooks. 7 maps that, for reasons that will become clearer the further we go, quietly disappeared from the dominant cartographic record. Some were buried in archives. Some were literally cut from atlases. Some survived only in the private collections of institutions that have never made them publicly available. The number 7 hit me before the geography did. 7 maps, across 3 centuries, each one showing a coastline, a continent, a waterway, or an interior that official history says no one had charted yet. And each one, in its own way, was eventually forgotten. I found the first one while looking for something else entirely. I was researching 16th century Portuguese trade routes for a project that had nothing to do with cartography. I was moving through microfilm archives at a university library, the kind of basement room that smells like preserved paper and institutional patience, when I came across a reference to a map called the Cantino Planisphere, a 1502 document. Portuguese origin. What stopped me was the footnote attached to it. A single line, half buried beneath a citation, noting that the map depicted the eastern coast of what we now call North America with a geographic accuracy that, according to the accepted timeline, should have been impossible at that date. The first confirmed English exploration of that coastline didn't happen until 1497. The first systematic coastal charting didn't happen for decades after that. So why did a Portuguese map from 1502 show it in such precise detail? That question pulled me down a corridor that took months to fully walk. And at the end of it were 6 more maps, each one raising the same kind of question. Each one suggesting that the world was known, more fully, more precisely, more globally, than the official history of exploration has ever comfortably admitted. Let me be fair to the official narrative before I interrogate it. The history of exploration, as most of us learned it, is a story of progressive discovery. The ancient world knew Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia. Medieval European cartographers filled unknown territories with sea monsters and speculation. Then, beginning in the mid-15th century, the Portuguese and Spanish pushed south and west. Columbus landed in 1492. Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498. And within 50 years, the rough outlines of the world's major land masses were finally sketched into existence. The process was slow, dangerous, and documented. Ships kept logs. Nations claimed credit. Maps were made publicly available or deliberately suppressed as state secrets, but they reflected the actual state of knowledge at the time. Exploration was linear. The world was revealed, piece by piece, in roughly the order the textbooks describe. That is the narrative, and for the most part, it is supported by a substantial body of evidence. The journey logs exist. The diplomatic correspondence exists. The commission charts, the royal decrees, the patents of discovery, they are all sitting, largely intact, in the national archives of Portugal, Spain, England, and the Netherlands. But the maps I found suggest something is sitting alongside that evidence that has never been adequately explained. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers are where it gets uncomfortable. The Cantino Planisphere, named after Alberto Cantino, a spy who smuggled it out of Lisbon in 1502 on behalf of the Duke of Ferrara, shows the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and most strikingly, the Atlantic coastline of what would become the eastern United States. The detail is not approximate. The Chesapeake Bay is recognizable. The outer banks of what is now North Carolina are rendered with accuracy that modern cartographers have confirmed would require extensive coastal survey work, not a single voyage of observation. The Italian historian Angelo Cattaneo, working from the original document held at the Biblioteca Estense in Medina, has noted that the hydrographic detail in certain sections implies first-hand knowledge of waters that, according to every known expedition log, had not yet been formally entered by European ships. Here is what that means in terms of raw chronology. Either someone explored that coastline in detail before 1502 and left no record that has survived, or there was a record, a source map, that fed into the Cantino, and that source has since disappeared. The Cantino is not alone. Speaking of source maps, there is the Piri-Reis map of 1513. This one is better known. It has attracted decades of amateur theorizing and professional dismissal in almost equal measure. But strip away the more extravagant claims that have been attached to it, and what remains is still genuinely strange. The map, drawn by the Ottoman Admiral Piri-Reis and now held at the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul, shows portions of South America with a degree of longitudinal accuracy that shouldn't have been achievable in 1513. Longitude was not accurately calculable at sea until the invention of the marine chronometer in the 18th century. Piri-Reis himself, in annotations on the map, wrote that he compiled it from 20 source charts, some of which he describes as dating to the time of Alexander the Great. Maybe that is boastful provenance building, the kind of legitimizing rhetoric common in the cartographic literature of the period. Maybe, but the source charts he describes, if they existed, have never been located. The Ottoman archives have been extensively cataloged. If those 20 source maps survived, they are not publicly accessible. Which brings me to the third document. The Vinland map first surfaced publicly in 1965 when Yale University acquired it. Dating, if authentic, to approximately 1440, it depicts a landmass to the west of Greenland labeled Vinlanda Insula, Vinland Island. The map was immediately controversial, and a 1974 ink analysis suggested it might be a forgery. Subsequent analyses, including a 2021 study from the University of Copenhagen using more refined spectroscopic techniques, have disputed the 1974 findings. As of this writing, the question of its authenticity has not been definitively resolved, and the map, which Yale acquired under circumstances that have never been fully disclosed, sits in the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library in a state of suspended scholarly judgment. The timing is almost theatrical. A map surfaces showing a North Atlantic landmass pre-Columbus, is immediately contested on technical grounds, and then remains in institutional limbo for 6 decades. I don't want to overstate what that means. Maps have been forged before. Provenance disputes are not inherently sinister. But the pattern, document surfaces, document is challenged, document is neither confirmed nor definitively debunked, document disappears into an archive. That pattern repeats in this story in ways that are difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Let's move to the fourth map. This one is less famous, and perhaps because of that, more interesting. The Jean Rot's Atlas of 1542, now held at the British Library under shelfmark Royal MS 20E.9, contains a chart of the southern hemisphere that shows, with reasonable accuracy, a large southern landmass. The continent we now call Antarctica was not sighted by European explorers, according to the accepted record, until 1820. The Jean Rot's southern chart predates that by nearly 3 centuries. Rots was a Scottish-born cartographer of French training who presented the atlas to Henry VIII in 1542. The southern landmass he drew is labeled La Terra Austral, the southern land. It is positioned roughly where Antarctica is. It has a rough coastline. It is not just a theoretical convention. Medieval maps often placed a speculative southern continent as a counterweight to the north, a concept derived from ancient Greek philosophy. Because the Rot's rendition contains apparent bay structures and coastal indentations that would be unusual for a purely theoretical construction. The British Library has held this document since the mid-19th century. It has been catalogued, digitized, and is technically accessible to researchers. What it has not been given is a satisfactory explanation. Which brings me to pattern. Because here is what I kept finding, map after map. Not suppression in the dramatic sense. No one appearing to have walked into an archive with a bonfire, but something subtler. A consistent pattern of downgrading. Maps that depicted things they shouldn't have were consistently classified as either forgeries, curiosities, coincidences, or theoretical exercises. The professional vocabulary used to dismiss them varied, but the effect was the same. They were placed at the edge of the accepted record and left there. The fifth map is perhaps the most striking example of this pattern. The Dieppe maps, a series of charts produced in the French port city of Dieppe between roughly 1536 and 1566, include several that depict a large, detailed landmass in the southern Pacific and Indian Ocean region in positions consistent with the coast of Australia. The Dutch East India Company's first recorded contact with the Australian coast occurred in 1606. The Dieppe maps predate that by 60 to 70 years. Multiple Dieppe charts show interior river systems along this supposed southern landmass, detail that would require inland exploration, not just coastal sailing. The historian Helen Wallace, who worked as map curator at the British Library for many years, noted in a 1988 paper that the consistency of the geographic detail across multiple independent Dieppe productions was difficult to explain without positing a common source. That source has never been identified. The Dieppe charts are held across several institutions: the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the British Library, the Huntington Library in California, and the National Library of Australia. They are collectively accessible. They have been studied. They have never been explained. Speaking of unexplained documents, there is the Wald-Seemuller map of 1507, and this one is different from the others because it was not forgotten. It was actively hunted. The Wald-Seemuller is the document that first applied the name America to the New World. Only one copy was known to survive. It spent 3 centuries in the private library of the Waldby-Gulfeg family in Germany, essentially unknown to the scholarly world, before being rediscovered in 1901. The Library of Congress acquired it in 2003 for $10 million, the highest price ever paid for a single map at that time. What is less often discussed is that Wald-Seemuller, within a few years of producing this landmark document, issued a second map that removed the name America entirely and replaced it with a different designation, as though he had decided the original attribution was incorrect. The reason for this reversal has never been satisfactorily explained. The cartographer appears to have changed his mind about who discovered the continent and then never publicly clarified why. His notes from this period, if they existed, have not been located. Maybe he received new information. Maybe political pressure from Spanish interests, who were invested in the Colombian priority claim, caused him to hedge. Maybe he simply made an error in the original and corrected it. But the withdrawal of the name he coined, from the very map that made it standard, is a strange act for a man who had just published what amounts to the most consequential cartographic document of the 16th century. And once you see this pattern, the unexplained withdrawal, the missing source, the institutional limbo, it is very hard to stop seeing it. The 7th map is the most recent, and in some ways the most troubling, precisely because it is not ancient. The Murray-Darling Basin surveys of the early 19th century included several detailed interior maps of southeastern Australia produced by colonial surveyors between roughly 1820 and 1860. Some of these surveys, specifically those produced by Thomas Mitchell during his 1836 expedition, contain notations indicating that he encountered geographic features and even evidence of agricultural modification of landscape that, according to the prevailing colonial understanding of the Aboriginal population, should not have existed. Mitchell noted in his journals, later published, that certain areas appeared to have been systematically managed. His maps include markings that his editors, preparing the published versions, altered or omitted. The original field notebooks, held at the State Library of New South Wales, show annotations that are not present in the published editions. The alteration was not secret. It was editorial. The decision was made, by people whose names are on record, to clean up Mitchell's more speculative observations before public circulation. What was cleaned away was evidence that the interior of the continent had been more extensively understood and managed by its indigenous inhabitants than the colonial record officially acknowledged. That is not cartographic mystery. That is documented editorial practice. And it is, in its own way, more disturbing than the ocean anomalies of the earlier maps, because the motive is more legible. Now I want to pull back and look at the shape of all 7 together, because I think there is a pattern here that matters.